Today we're looking at something a bit different. So there is a Vim plugin component, however the plugin itself isn't really that important. So this is a website called Vim Bootstrap, which basically lets you generate a Vimrc with all of the basic sort of stuff you're going to want to have if you want to do any sort of programming work inside of Vim. Now, if we scroll down, as we're going to see, there's a pretty decent selection of languages in here. There's not everything I'd want there to be. So, for example, you don't have Java here. Now, I'm not a big fan of using Java myself, but if you do need to do Java work, it would be nice to have that support, and same is true for things like C# and a couple of other common languages. Is Go there? Yes, Go is there. So I'm going to set it up to do some web development. Obviously, you can set it up the way that you want it to be. I'm just going to do it like this for today, though. And if we have a look at the framework, so this is just web frameworks. For some reason, they only have Vue.js, but there's no reason why you couldn't very easily support something like React and Angular. React is basically just HTML tags inside of a JavaScript file, and Angular is mainly just HTML with some extra variables built inside of it, so I don't see why that one's missing. Now, as for the color schemes, this is also fairly limited, but we do have the only correct option right here. Now, one thing I would like to see is these images here actually being, showing you what the color scheme actually is rather than just this generic image. So seeing these are the colors of Code Dark, these are the colors of Dracula, these are the colors of Molokai, that would actually be really useful to see. But we're going to go with Code Dark for today. And then we can also select what sort of Vim we're actually using, whether we're using Vim or NeoVim. Now, it would also be nice to see, configurations for things like OniVim or GVim or things like that. But it's not really that big of a deal. And then you can just go and click on this button down here and it will download the file. So I'm just going to save it into my home directory. Obviously, if you're using NeoVim, go and put it in your .config/nvim and rename it to init.vim. And if you're using regular Vim, name the file to .vimrc. However, I'm already running this, so let's just go over to my Vim install and actually open up the file so we can see what it looks like. So, as you can see, this is basically how it looks running the Code Dark theme. It looks as you would expect it to. We have a top bar up here, which I typically don't run. This comes from Airline, and obviously we have Airline down the bottom here. Now, one weird decision they made is to include the little powerline symbols for the NeoVim config, even though it's known that powerline symbols don't render properly inside of terminal NeoVim. So including those is a bit of a weird choice. So the first thing you'll see in this Vim config is it's checking if you have Vim plug installed, and it's also checking what operating system you're on so it can work out where curl is actually located, and obviously it's going to try to download Vim plug if you don't have it installed. And from here, basically we have some setup for the actual Bootstrap plugin itself. So this is just sort of how it works. I'm not going to go over this stuff because I don't think the Bootstrap plugin is really that interesting. I think what it's actually downloading is a bit more interesting. So if we scroll past all of that, we can actually get to the plugins that they think are important to actually install. So the first one we have is Nerdtree. Now, Nerdtree is the file tree. It looks a little something like this. I'm not the biggest fan of Nerdtree, but it's sort of the de facto standard when people want a really good file tree to actually use in Vim. It works well enough, and I opened it up by pressing F3. F3 is not a binding I'm a big fan of, but it sort of works well enough. You also have the Nerdtree tab plugin for working with tabs inside a Nerdtree, but there's no binding to actually open that up. It's not really that big of a deal, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, another thing we have besides that is FCF. So if you'd prefer to use a fuzzy finder instead of a file tree, that option is there as well. And you open that up by pressing leader E. And in this case, leader is set to comma. Another weird choice, but I could get used to it being on comma. We also have Vim Commentary available as an easy way to comment out various parts of the document. There isn't a binding for this, but if you just run the commentary command, it will then comment stuff out. Now, I use commentary on my personal setup because this is sort of the easiest way to do commenting inside of Vim. And following from that one, we have another T-Poke plugin, another very popular one, Vim Fugitive. So Vim Fugitive is basically the standard way of doing Git integration inside of Vim. So if you do the G command and then say run status, that will then try to run Git status, but we're not in a Git directory right now. Let's actually go and cd into one of those so I can show you how that works. And if we run G status, as we're going to see, it runs that command there, and basically every single Git command works with Fugitive, and some of them are made to actually work really nicely inside of Vim. And along with that, we also have another Git plugin. This one is Git Gutter. However, it seems like it's not actually configured correctly. So if you noticed over in that other file I had open, it wasn't actually showing anything on the sidebar here, and I had to look through the settings for this, and I can't work out what it's actually doing to disable that. So for whatever reason, Git Gutter doesn't seem to be working properly. There might just be something going on with my Vim install, but it seems to work fine on my personal setup. Going down from that, we also have tag bar for listing out C tags, but this actually requires an external dependency in the form of exuberant C tags, but it doesn't actually let you know this anywhere in the file itself. You have to try to run the plugin and watch it fail to see it. Now, basically what exuberant C tags does is indexes the code file and indexes the entire code base to make it so it's easier to jump around with things like the function names, the variable names, and things like that. Basically, you can jump between the markers in the file, and it provides an easier way to move around. We also get Indent Line, which basically marks where an indentation is actually happening, where it's not entirely clear what's actually contained inside the indentation. So for example, in this file right here, between these 2 points here, it's drawn a line which indicates that this bit right here is inside of this indentation. Personally, I don't think it's really that useful unless you're trying to do, say, Python code, for example, where indentation is actually important, but it isn't really that bad of an addition. Delimit Mate is basically a plugin to automatically close things like quotation marks and brackets and things like that. It's basically just a really nice plugin to have. I'm not using this one myself. I've got a different plugin, but it does basically the exact same job. And we've also got Vim Polyglot, which is basically a big syntax pack to make it so most languages will actually have their syntax highlighting working correctly, because out of the box, Vim works fine in some languages, but others it's a little bit weird, especially when you start getting into things like web frameworks. It basically just falls apart and start doing whatever with its syntax highlighting. So we also have ALE to do syntax checking, and if we go down a bit, we can see we have Vim Snippets and Ulti-Snips. So these are for doing various code snippets, and then you can actually just generate those code snippets in the code. Now you might notice that one thing is missing here, and that is code completion, so you can't automatically generate function calls or variable names or things like that. I'm not sure why this is missing. I know obviously some people don't like COC, but you could have used something like dopleet or YCM, but not having any sort of code completion at all really makes it struggle as a competent way to work with code. And the last of the plugins are these two right here, which are basically session manager plugins. So if I go and quit out of this file now and I reopen the file, it will actually remember where I was at. Now, I've never actually used Vim session management, but it seems to be pretty useful, and I might actually integrate this into my own config. Now, actually, I did say that was the last of the plugins, but there actually are more plugins. But I'm not going to go into detail on these because these are basically just the code plugins. So when you go and add in language support, basically all it's going to do is download the syntax for that language and maybe some like syntax checker. In the case of HTML, it does give you access to Emmet Vim, which is a nice choice, but if you add something like C, it's not going to give you code completion in C, it's basically just going to give you C syntax. Going down a bit further, we basically get to our basic settings, and there's not really much to say about this. It's fairly uncontroversial what they're doing. We have our tab stop set to 4, we have our encoding set. I don't really have anything to say about this. This is all just sensible defaults that you probably should be using. So let's just keep going down, and you're going to get to this setting right here. So this actually puts Vim into 256 color mode. Now, Vim Code Dark is actually a true color plugin, so this is actually running in its color compatibility mode, so it's not looking as good as it could. However, it looks pretty good, I would say. Now, the reason why they do this is because not every terminal actually has true color support, so this is just basically there to do compatibility. The next thing of interest is abbreviation. So if you go and say, right, capital WQ and then exclamation mark, as we can see, it goes and changes that into a different form. So obviously, capital WQ isn't actually a command. This will basically go and change it into the form that it should be in. I actually use this in my main configuration now, and it's actually really, really useful. We have some other unimportant configuration for nerd tree, grep.vim, and things like that. And if we go down past these auto commands, we have some bindings for things like splitting, Fugitive, Session Management, and then this one for working with tabs. Now, I don't really use tabs inside of Vim just because I find them a little bit annoying to work with, but inside of this, if we press Shift-T, it opens up a new tab, and then we can actually cycle through the tabs by just pressing Tab or Shift-Tab to go in the other direction. Now, I know that if you're used to working with the vanilla way of working with tabs, that's probably a little bit annoying. However, if you're not, that is a massive improvement. We have the fix in here for working with the clipboard, so this actually interacts with the system clipboard rather than just working with the one built into Vim. We have some bindings here for working with the B command to move between buffers, so BP and BN. Personally, I don't use these myself, but if you prefer to use these over the tab commands, these are here to use instead. If we go down a bit more, we have the fixes for moving between splits. So instead of having to do Control W and then the direction, now it's just Control and the direction. If you're not doing that, I don't know what you're doing. And we have the fix for the visual mode indentation. So if we go and highlight this and then press the greater than sign, as we can see, it doesn't actually lose the selection, so we can indent this as much as we want. It's a nice addition and everyone should be using it. Now, if you scroll through this document, you'll probably notice that there's not really much going on in terms of documentation. We get like a little comment here and there, but this kind of assumes that you actually know how to configure Vim. And if you know how to configure Vim, you're probably not going to be using this. So I would like to see some extra, additions to this, so new users who actually might want to use this actually can come into this and then actually work on a configuration with this as their base. But even if you don't want to modify it, it seems to be a fairly uncontroversial way of configuring Vim, but in doing so, it lacks a lot of the basic tools like things such as COC, which I think are basically fundamental for working with code in Vim. So I wouldn't recommend using it in its base state, but if you do want something to configure from and you know how to configure Vim, it might not be a terrible choice if you don't want to start from scratch. Now, as for me, I won't be running this. However, I have found some configuration in here and some plugins which I have added to my main configuration. For example, we have this one right here. So NZZZV. Basically, what this is going to do is when you actually, cycle through by pressing N, it's going to center the screen, which I think is actually kind of useful. Sometimes when I press N, it's going to be like at the top, sometimes it'll be at the bottom, and in those cases, it's kind of hard to spot where it's actually jumping to. But if the line is actually centered, it kind of makes it a bit easier for me. Obviously, this is something that a lot of people won't be used to. However, I think it's kind of nice. And same with things like the abbreviations. I've added those into my main configuration. And yeah, I think if nothing else, this is a great way to discover new plugins and new configuration. So I think that's pretty much everything for me. But before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Corbinian, Andrew, Craig, Nathan, Monster, Chico Bento, Joseph, Peter D, Road, Tony, Brennan, Donald, John, Marek, Mikkel, Nate Dog, Nephite, Tees, and Zilva. If you want to go and support my work, there'll be some links down below to my Patreon, Subscribestar, LibrePay, all of that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and this channel is available on Library, Odyssey, BitTune, BitChute, and all of that sort of stuff if you want to watch on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.